Hello everyone, Dr. Shabazz here, and today I will be covering material in Chapter 13. This has been long overdue. I know I have made mention of this particular chapter, and because we're not covering Chapter 15, that's the last chapter of the book. I am not going to cover that chapter. It is on accounting, controls in the global environment, and I think specifically the exact title is Accounting and Taxation in Global Business. We will not be covering that. We've run out of time and we have to prepare for our team projects. And by the way, I have made some changes. I sent a Canvas message, which I will share now and just give you an idea of what the update entails. So as you can see here, I sent this on last night, and actually I sent it this morning, 12:25 a.m. And what I am suggesting is that because we only have 2 chapters on this exam, that we handle that on Thursday and get that out of the way, and then we'll have another week to prepare for our team projects. That will be on Friday, which is the 11th. Now, for the 2 o'clock class, the time for our scheduled time for the finals block is 7:30 a.m. So we have to get up with the birds and just make sure that we are present and that we don't oversleep. There has never been a case that I remember, maybe 1 or 2 cases where someone was late for the 7:30 a.m. exam, but it almost never happens. People tend to set their alarms and they have their teammates to give them a wake-up call. I remember one semester I had offered if any student needed a wake-up call that I would call them. And one student said, okay, I need a wake-up call, and I called them and made sure that they were up. But make sure that you set your cell phone and you set your alarm so that you're able to make the presentation. The 3:30 class session will be at 12:30. This is the final schedule that's issued by the university, and you notice that we don't have the regular class times, and this is university-wide. So we can't easily just change the time to say, hey, let's do it Monday, let's do it Wednesday, because then it conflicts with other classes. And so as you can see, on Thursday, we will have our exam, but on tomorrow, we will actually have our last journal day, which will be dealing with international marketing, which is a very interesting chapter. We had chapter 12, which dealt with global marketing, which is the same thing, and we dealt with a range of issues concerning the challenges of going overseas and marketing abroad. A lot of different rules based upon laws and different regulations, of course, culture, politics, all of these play a role in marketing abroad. But this idea of supply chain, and this chapter is titled Global Operations and Supply Chain Management. We actually have 3 programs here in SBI on supply chain. And so we offer three different degree programs, and that was actually constructed by Dr. Scott Sutterfield before he left and retired from SBI. And it is a very, very crucial field, because when you talk about supply chain, you're talking about the entire process of a product being produced, what it takes to produce the product in terms of the materials, procurement, operations, marketing, distribution, and customer service. There's a whole supply chain, which is very important to optimize all of those activities within the supply chain. So we'll talk about that in the next hour. Some of the other things that we have for your presentation on next week, I will give you an outline or guidelines for what that presentation will entail, the amount of time that will be required, how you're to dress, and all the other particulars about your actual plan, your typewritten copy that you are to present. Now, again, you are to pretend that you are a consulting company and I have hired you to go out and research the country that you're doing, because I want to know if it is plausible for me to go in that country, and when it's plausible for me to go in that country, and also to give me an idea of what industries might be good to go into. So consulting companies often have to do this for companies who are making these considerations and don't have the resources and don't have the knowledge to be able to do this on their own. So they'll pay a consulting company to do this, to do an assessment, and these consulting companies make a lot of money doing this. Whether or not that company decides to do anything with that advice, that consulting company still gets a pretty expensive fee. So, be that as it may, that is where we're going. And again, next week will be our last week. And I also want to remind everyone to do those course evaluations that they were sent through Canvas. I believe they were sent through Canvas. And I know we got a message, the faculty members got a message saying that there was kind of a low response rate. So make sure you go and you do those for feedback, because we need that. The professors need it as well as the school needs it for their assessment of whether we are doing an effective job at delivering the content. Of course, this was a very different semester, but be that as it may, we certainly would appreciate it if you filled out that information. So we're going to talk about global operations and supply chain management. And I hope that some of you have looked at global supply chain management as a potential career. I think it has a future, particularly because it is a more of a specialist type of area. And it can be very analytical, and typically when you're in supply chain management, you're dealing with a lot of optimization models. And that is a skill that is high in need by companies. Because now, since we have a supply chain that's more electronic, there's a greater need to have more optimized methods of distributing products. So we're going to talk about this, and I'm going to push through some of these slides. And global operations management. So we're talking about production, we're talking about manufacturing, and we're talking about the whole service aspect of the product. That is a very big part. I remember working in the computer industry for a manufacturing company, and I was a marketing tech support rep. And so what we did is we had to ensure that the products that we sold to the customer were meeting their objectives in terms of functionality, in terms of productivity, in terms of perhaps making things a lot more efficient. And we were the ones to hold their hands and to make sure we provided them with the service so that they can get the maximum amount of functionality out of the equipment. And so that service system was very important to our company. Now, this system, we talk about a production system model. You have suppliers. Now, these suppliers are actually, these are the companies that will be supplying you with the inputs, the raw materials, the components that you need to make your products. whether it be electronic components, whether it be a raw material like wheat, whether it be planks of wood, or whatever it is that you need to make your product. These are inputs that go into the production process. Your production process can come in many different flavors. Now you have, depending on the type of goods that you're making, you can have a very sophisticated production process where you have a large, you have a large factory. You can have a production process where you're making t-shirts, where it's very simple, or you're making some garments, or you're making something that basically entails you taking something like a mouse pad, putting your logo on it, that is also producing, and then selling those to the customer as a branded type of product. So there are many different levels of this production process. And then you have the outputs. You have, after that, the distribution. So in between outputs here and customers here, you have a distribution channel. And that distribution channel can be direct to the customer, from the manufacturer directly to the customer. You can use wholesalers, you can use retailers, and a number of other intermediaries that you can use in order to get that product to your customer. I'd like to show you a clip of just what is supply chain management and how other countries may view this industry and the importance of it. And so I'll give you a video presentation by a professor from Michigan State University. His name is Thomas Holt, but he teaches at Michigan State University in the area of supply chain management. And here is what he has to say about the field.
I'm very delighted to be here. I think that mic is on and this mic is definitely on, so I'm mic'd up like crazy for those of you that are sitting back there. This is a first for me to have two mics at the same time. There's going to be a lot of slides. I can make them available to you if you find it interesting. There are also about 16 copies of the book out there, so those of you that run really, really fast, you can probably grab one of those. That was the box we shipped over, I guess. And I will wander around a little bit. So part of what we're doing, you can probably hear my accent. I'm from Sweden, so I'm in the general vicinity of here, even though I live in the United States in Michigan. So I travel around the world and I do a lot of different supply chain things, and global supply chains are becoming quite important. So Chi is going to talk about starting the supply chain center here, and I think that's a fantastic opportunity, not only for England or the UK, but also overall going sort of outside United States to do supply chain management. Some of you are actually in supply chain management, and you're going to notice that oftentimes in Europe we don't call it supply chain management, we call it logistics, and sometimes we broaden that a little bit to talk about value chains. If we do the same thing in the United States, we talk about supply chain management. If we do the same thing in Asia, we talk about operations. And oftentimes when we take it to Latin America, we talk about operations research. In Asia, we talk about operations management. So get a little bit jumbled together in terms of what we do. So let's talk about global supply chain management in that context. And the general starting point, of course, is that I would put my name up there and probably some fancy title and some other cool stuff. But since we're doing this book, and if you can't run really fast, it's very cheap anyway. It's £20 on UK Amazon, I think, the Amazon version over here. So, and if that seems high to you guys, I guess talk to that guy. Talk to Keith Niblett and just give your card to him, and I'm sure he can find you somewhere with a free book if you find it valuable. What we did was, so at Michigan State University, for about 60 years, we've been focusing on different aspects of supply chain management. There are about 25 of us doing different aspects of supply chains. Generally divided into logistics, purchasing, operations, and market channels. Market channels will be the last mile of the chain where we try to customize what we do and get our products and services out to customers. Those are different components, but they're also hard to integrate, hard to deal with, hard to coordinate. We deal with all of those different things at Michigan State University. We've been doing it for 60-some years, We've called it different things. At one point in time, it was simply transportation and logistics and other different configurations. We do a tremendous amount of executive training. Today's talk will be sort of a 30,000-foot level to hopefully whet your appetite a little bit about global supply chains or perhaps supply chains in general.
So as you can see, Dr. Holt, who I mentioned, I think I said no, he's Norwegian, he's actually Swedish, had mentioned in the beginning about how supply chain management is seen around the world, and he talked about what it was actually called in different parts of the world. He mentioned logistics, the label being used in Europe, and he mentioned operations management in Asia and supply chain in the US, and all of these different, I guess you can say, concepts. When I took a course in graduate school, we called it production management. And so you have all of these different concepts. But essentially, it is a kind of an analytical tool where you start talking about the idea of optimization. So when you take a class like logistics and production management, you get into models, you get into PERT charts, you get into decision trees, you get into all of these different analytical concepts that are highly quantitative, because what you're trying to do is optimize the supply chain. This process that you see on the screen here, from supplier to the customer, is made up of a lot of different activities that one has to control in terms not only of cost, but also in terms of relationships in within that within the two points. So we look at some of the different ideas. The production facility, where are the products made? Is it a factory? Is it a shop? Is it offshore? Is it someplace in the United States and then they're exported? Where are these locations? That's very important from a cost standpoint. And I mentioned in a previous chapter, it is possible that if you don't make these products, because there's always a make or buy decision. Do we make it ourselves or do we buy it? For example, for a supplier to supply me with components, I have a choice. I can either get them from a supplier or I can make them myself. What is the drawback? In this chapter, they talk about the pros and cons in terms of global procurement, advantages of global procurement and disadvantages of global procurement. And procurement is the department that will get these products in from the supplier. And so there are certainly pros and cons of getting your products from a supplier. They also mention on page 324 about making your own products. And the disadvantages, the pros and cons of making your own products. Of course, you could imagine that if you make your own products, that they're going to be customized to suit your specs and that everything will be more compatible. And of course, there are also disadvantages. So we'll get to that a bit later. And there you have components, that these inputs going into the production process, raw materials, things I mentioned like wheat, things like oil, cocoa, cotton. These are all considered raw materials that may be used to make something else. And then you have the production stages, which can be in various, you can have various stages inside of your production mechanism. You may know about the R&D department. So you research the product, the feasibility of the product, and whether you can sustain that product, the production of that product. But then also when you talk about the research and design, you want to make sure that it is also affordable, because of the fact that If your materials or your inputs are too high in terms of the price point, then you have to somehow recoup your cost, and typically that's comes out of the price, the consumer price, and what they pay for it. And I must say here, when you talk about value added, and Dr. Holt talked about the supply chain, so there is value added at each point. Let's say, for example, you're making, you are a baker and you have a bakery. And so your end product are pastries, right? Cakes, pies, and rolls, and bread, and those sorts of things, cookies, just like Todd Wilson. But there is a process. You have wheat. You need wheat to make your products. So a farmer produces the wheat, the stalks of wheat. They sell that wheat to another company. That company is in charge of milling the wheat in other grains, because they have the factories that they can grind the wheat down and make it into various types of end products, different consistencies of wheat, maybe for animal feed, some of it's for baking, some of it's for other types of products. The same with corn, and the same with many of these other types of raw materials, whether it be cotton, whether it be oil. Thing about oil is when you take a barrel of oil and it goes to the refinery, you see in the water those refineries, look like they're on stilts. But they have these refineries that will extract perhaps several different types of derivatives out of the petroleum. So you can have things like kerosene, you can have things like gasoline, you can have things like diesel fuel, you can have oil that is used for plastics, which is a big use for petroleum. You can have another derivative that is specifically for fabrics and for other types of end products. So all of this comes from petroleum. So this you have value added at each point. So in our example, the farmer provides value. The miller that grinds up the wheat provides even more value, because that wheat that's ground up can then be turned into a baked good, right? So the bakery, your bakery adds value. And then how do you distribute it? Well, you may go to a bakery. You may go to and try to get your products in Whole Foods or Publix. You may try to sell them yourself. But if you use a distributor or if you use a retail outlet, they provide value because of what reason? They have many outlets, and you can have higher visibility to get your product sold and get your product positioned in front of the consumer. So at each point, there's a value added to the process. And then when the consumer finally pays for that product, the retail outlet gets a markup, and then they get their margins. But with just a little side note, if you as a consumer want to buy a cake or you want to buy a baked good, you can do three things. You can make it yourself. You can go to Publix and you can get it on the shelf, it's already made, or you can get it custom made from a baker, a professional baker. Those are three choices that you have. If you make it yourself, it's probably cheaper, but it might not be as good. And it might take what? Time. It might take time that you're not willing to invest at that particular time. You can buy it off the counter. It's already made. It has happy birthday on there and everything. And you just pick it up and you go. It's a convenience. But the cake might not be exactly what you want, and you have to pick what's there, what's on the shelf. Thirdly, you can have a baker to make it. Now, that cake will probably be perfect because it's customized, but it would be more expensive. So there's a trade-off in terms of when you talk about your choices that the customer has. But of course, there is value added along the supply chain. Operations management, which Dr. Hope referred to as the term that's used a lot in Asia. Management of the direct resources that are involved in the production system of a business organization. So you have domestic and you have global. When all of your productive capacity is domestic, and then you engage in exporting, right? That's the model. You produce here, you export to other countries, as opposed to having a factory abroad where you outsource or you have offshore services and then you export from that location. You might have cheaper labor, cheaper materials, you may have lower regulations, you may have maybe access to materials that are more readily available than having those materials shipped to you and then making them domestically and then exporting them out. There are many different ways that you can manage your supply chain. So we mentioned procurement, acquisition of goods and services, the procurement department, production, logistics. Logistics is another word that was mentioned by Dr. Holt. It's another one of those terms that's associated with supply chain management. Movement of materials in the production system. And then R&D, I mentioned before, research and development. That's also a part of the production process because you need to have the specs of what is to be built. So you get a product that you're making, you have to tell those who are on the floor producing the products the specs so that they'll know how to assemble it and they'll know what the benchmarks are and the error tolerance that they need to follow in order to make sure that product is accepted. Make or buy decision. I mentioned before, that's the choice that you have to make. You could either make your products that you normally get for suppliers, you can say, okay, I'm going to eliminate that cost, supplier cost, and I want to make them myself. Now again, there's pros and cons of that. You make them yourself, like Apple makes most of their components for their computers. And they have a reputation for having quality, scalability in terms of using computers over a long period of time, reliability. They have all of these things because their components are designed to work together. Now there's a premium you pay. If you notice, Apple computers are more expensive because you pay for the quality, you pay for the compatibility, you pay for the scalability and all those things that come with making your own product. Or you can buy, or Apple can buy from another company, from Intel, from AMD, from all these other companies that make chips. But it won't be specifically an Apple chip, even though if Apple says to Intel that we want you to make us a chip for our Apple computer, yeah, certainly they can do that, but it won't be made by Apple. And there is some difference because there's a limit to what Apple will reveal about their architecture. Now, obviously, they have to reveal enough for them to be able to make the chip compatible, but of course, it's going to be very different if Apple is making it themselves. So that is a major decision to make. You are going to most likely become a manager one day, or a CEO or an entrepreneur, where you have to decide: are you going to make these products yourself, or are you going to outsource and get somebody else to supply them, and then you just buy them from that person at scale? You buy a large amount and you get a lower per unit cost, as opposed to you trying to make them yourself and not, first of all, being an expert in the area that can make your supply chain less efficient if you go into that. That would actually be called this vertical integration. If you wanted to, say, assume the that part of your supply chain, you wanted to eliminate the supplier, but you wanted to take on that role yourself, then okay, you have to do that very carefully. That is a form of vertical integration, but it's not always likely that a company would have the expertise to integrate in that way. Why would a bakery say that, okay, in order to secure my supply, I'm going to buy a wheat farm and I'm going to ensure I have my supply of wheat? Well, you're not an expert at farming, you're an expert at baking. And so that's where your energy should go, because otherwise you'll have a lot of issues with managing such an operation for your inputs, and that wouldn't be an efficient way to for your supply chain. Global production, finding locations where you can have your products made at the most efficient rate. Here's some of the advantages of global procurement. This is, again, outsourcing. No need to invest money associated with making. Focuses on production stages and components with the most value added. Maximizes flexibility by allocating orders among the suppliers in a dynamic way, which basically means if you can get a better deal from another supplier, you have the flexibility to move and change suppliers in and out based upon who has the best quality and who has the best per unit cost. And then your input purchases, as they grow over a period of time, you get a lower per unit cost, and your economies of scale are a lot smoother, and then you can make bigger margins. Buying firm does not need to learn a new business. I mentioned before, if you're a baker and you want your supply of wheat or your input to be secured, you may not necessarily want to go into wheat farming because you would have to learn how to farm, and it just doesn't make sense from a production standpoint. So you would probably get your supply from someone who has milled the grain and sell it in these big sacks. You have these huge sacks of flour that you can buy from a bakery supply store, which is basically wholesale. And that miller that has taken the grain and ground it up has done the work for you. So you don't have to grow your wheat, you don't have to grind your wheat, you just buy it in a big sack. And that's value added. You pay for that, you pay for those services, but still it's a convenience that helps you to have a more efficient supply chain. And these are some of the other factors here. One of the things about when you talk about getting your supplies, one of the things that companies often do when they look at a supplier, they also want to know if there is a proximity to a market that once the products are made, well, maybe we can sell these to the locals. We're not here just for producing products and exporting them elsewhere. We might be able to sell these products right here where the products are made. That would be a very big benefit to having a production facility in a country where there's a captive market, and because the distribution channel is a lot shorter, and of course you can be more responsive to that market than you can if you make the product, say, in China, and then you export those products from China to Malaysia, to Japan, to South Korea, to India, and elsewhere. You have a location advantage as the language goes in the business. So here's some of the disadvantages: relying on suppliers on production. That can get risky, especially if your supplier has a snafu of at some point, where they have some kind of issue. And let's say, for example, that it's not something as catastrophic as, say, their machine breaking down. But let's say and that can happen, but let's say, for example, that the supplier that's making components for your inputs, they're getting their products for their components from another supplier. And let's say their supplier that's offering them parts for these components that you're buying go up in price. Then what happens? Your supplier for those components will go up in price. So for you, you either have to pay more if you want the same amount, or your supplier would say to you that you have to order more. If you want to keep the same cost, you have to order a larger amount. So in essence, you're going to be paying more in the long run. So that is a risk if you have your supplier relationships. You have to rely on them to maintain the quality of the inputs, to deliver them on time, and to give you a reasonable price point so you don't have to increase your own products in the end. Difficulty in enforcing contracts with foreign suppliers. This is a nightmare. I had a friend who was actually visiting the campus years ago. He was here for homecoming. And I was surprised to see him, and I asked him, "What are you doing here?" And so I knew where he went to school. He went to school in Chicago at a school called IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, a very good school there. And he said that he was here on the invitation of a friend. And we started talking, and I said, "Yeah, I'm here. I'm teaching global business." And I told him that at one point in time I was thinking about doing international consulting, which is similar to what the different projects you're doing. And he says, "I tried it. I tried doing that." And he said, "You know what? I just couldn't make money. And the reason I couldn't make money is because I couldn't get deliveries. I couldn't make guarantees. I wasn't getting paid. There were all these logistical challenges that he was dealing with." And he was just like, "Hey," he says, "keep this job. Don't quit your job for that, but use this as a base in order to do some of these other things. Maybe you do it in the summertime." But he was talking about just the headaches that he had in trying to make this whole process work in terms of international trade and how difficult it was to enforce these contracts. And so that's one of the things that you will deal with when you do business overseas. It's that whole idea of contracts and just kind of understanding, what does this contract actually mean, which is something important to understand, because you got different, you have different ideas of what contracts are. And so you have to be very clear on the guarantees that are agreed upon by both parties. Competing against other competitors for the attention of critical component suppliers. Okay, this is a big issue. Big issue. Because what happens is, you all know about first mover advantage. You got an innovator who's first in the market, and they get to tie up all the supplier relationships. They get to establish the best relationships, and which will preempt competitors from coming in, because this company, the first mover, already has the best prices in terms of per unit cost, right? So, but let's say somehow that this competing company develops as time goes on, and once those products are being sold, those competitors will buy your product and they will reverse engineer it, and they will look at it. They'll look at what it takes to build a product. They'll hire another producer. And then once you have more competition in the market, you have more flexibility in terms of your choices and options to get your supplies. So then you have the competition. So then it becomes the idea of making sure that you don't get a competitive disadvantage, because now you may be stuck with a particular supplier for a guaranteed to buy a certain quantity because you have established this relationship. So competing against each other, against other competitors for the attention of critical component suppliers is very real. Suppliers typically want to deal with companies that are going to offer some volume. They'll give you the per unit cost, but you have to take on the volume. So then they're getting their money up front, and they're giving you the per unit discount. And then lastly, profits earned by producing goods and services in-house will instead go to the suppliers, because you may be less efficient to produce this in-house than outsourcing. So you have a lot of different factors here. Buying that gives power to the suppliers of the industry standard or creates scarcity of those components. And yeah, it's a disadvantage because of course the supplier, especially if it's a scarce component, you're kind of stuck because they raise the price, then you have to end up raising your price as well into your end product, unless you buy enough quantity from your supplier to offset the increase. All of these factors, procuring goods and services from suppliers, carries the risk of those suppliers providing the same goods and services to direct competitors, where there's really nothing you can do about that. You know, if you have a product that is a general product like a microchip, and you're going to have a lot of manufacturers who are going to be using that chip. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Now, if you are the first mover, you can preempt that by locking up that relationship. But when other competitors come into the market also producing those components, you're kind of stuck because you could have a better deal, but you're already locked in with that supplier for a particular amount of time. So, pros and cons. So, outsourcing, we saw a video dealing with the other side of outsourcing. That was a case of India. And I'm kind of checking my notes to make sure I'm covering everything here. But that was a good case study, and hopefully you got a lot out of watching that video, because I think it was a very instructive example of companies looking abroad because they're taking advantage of not only an abundance of labor, but frankly, quality of labor. Because in India, they have some of the best engineers, bar none. They can compete with those at MIT. Mm-hmm. They can compete with those at Caltech and some of these top schools. And they're a lot cheaper. So you have that kind of idea in the supply chain. So outsourcing, domestic outsourcing, where you actually don't make it in-house, but you choose a company that is within your country to also supply these inputs for you. And then obviously global outsourcing, offshoring, so you can have different services. We saw a video on, well, it was about money laundering, but the giant beast that is the global economy had Kal Penn, who was going around trying to launder $1 million. And he was looking at offshore banking. So you're basically going to other countries trying to find more hospitable conditions for your funds, to try to shelter your funds from taxes. And so that's one example of offshoring. The way they define it here is when the firm doing the outsourcing and the supplier that will provide outsourced goods and services are located in different countries. So in Kal Penn's case, it was Cyprus, but you have others like the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas and many of these other countries that you don't hear much about. Liechtenstein, Monaco, they all have these offshore banking systems, and also Switzerland, which you've heard quite a bit about, the Swiss Alps and Swiss watches and all these things. Swiss accounts are more associated with people who are trying to hide money. It's not illegal to have a Swiss account, but that is the reputation. When you hear Swiss accounts, people will imply that someone is trying to hide money so that they evade taxes. And then insourcing, when the firm has been buying goods and services from suppliers, then decides to make these goods themselves. And so that is, in international business, there's something called import substitution, which means that if you are importing goods from another place because of cheaper prices, you can say, we're going to produce these at home because we want to create jobs and we want to do all the things here that are customized for our society. That is called import substitution. This is called, when you're talking about manufacturing, this is called insourcing, where you say, we're not going to get our products and our supplies from abroad. We're going to produce them here, and we want to create jobs and make these in-house. So that is one concept that's also happening. It has also happened with Apple computers. This is when President Trump came into office. He said he was going to bring some of these jobs back, and he was focusing a lot on Apple computers. So some of the advantages, I mentioned Apple making these specialized components so that you have greater compatibility, scalability, reliability, all of these things. You're saying Apple computers don't crash, they don't have viruses, they don't have all of these things because you have all of these different elements that work so well together that there are no breaches in the architecture of Apple products. So what else does it allow? Not only the knowledge of the product, but also control of the component. You can control the quality of it. You can control the changes made to it. You control the delivery of the product. You can have highly specialized and customized products that you don't have to pay a premium for if they're produced in-house. You just need to make sure that you have the engineering know-how in order to do that, and you might have to pay those engineers quite a bit of money, $150,000, $200,000, to produce the types of components and supplies that you want. In-housing processing activities increase the complexity of the firm's production process. Well, yeah, that's true. It's true in a sense that you need to have a separate department that's up to speed, that has it benchmarking, that has quality control, that has all of these elements in place. And yeah, it is a major, major undertaking when you have an internal production department. And not only the staffing and the, getting the intellectual capital, the talent coming in, but yeah, it's just a real massive undertaking. And maybe it's easier that you can get your products from elsewhere, but then you get the pros versus con argument that we just saw on the slides. The firm incurs both fixed and variable costs. You all have taken enough accounting classes to know about fixed and variable costs, because ultimately that gets into break-even analysis. So you have to determine how many components are we making based upon our variable costs, or how many units that we are producing per period, and our fixed costs, which don't change every period. They're the same, but then you have to control those costs because you want to make sure that you're making the margins that you set out to make. So again, it's a major undertaking to control those costs. Otherwise, you end up cutting into your margins. Very, very difficult process. And so when you have these companies that make these components, it is a very serious task that department has to manage. Location decision I mentioned earlier. Do you make them domestically? Do you make them overseas? Once you decide where you're making those, how will you then get those finished products to their destination? If you make them here, then you will export. You get your raw materials, you make in-house, then you export. Or you go abroad where raw materials are plentiful, you make your products, and then you export from there. So you've got a lot of different models. And then you run the numbers and figure out that, okay, it might be cheaper to make these in Thailand, or cheaper to make these in Singapore or Taiwan or India or wherever the place may be, rather than to make them in-house and then export them. Raw materials, again, these are, when we talk about components and raw materials, considerations for one versus many production facilities. Do you have all of your materials made in one place, or do you have factories that are distributed around the world so you can increase your economies of scale, depending on the region that you're in? The level of the fixed costs associated with having one or more production facilities. If you have more than one production facility, then you have different fixed costs because you're in different locations, you have different rules, you have different economic factors, you have different financial factors, you have all of these factors that are very different. So that is another challenge. The minimum efficient scale of production facility in comparison to demand for its output. So you're producing in these various markets. In our class, we have 8 countries. We have 8 countries that we're doing an assessment on. All of these 8 countries have different demand conditions. And let's say I have a product of my company that you all are consulting me on. I have 8 teams, and all of you all are consulting me on different countries. Now, I have to decide that if I take your assessment and I move on it and I say, okay, I'm going to set up a production facility in these 8 countries, I have to realize that there's going to be a difference because perhaps there's a different demand condition in these countries. You take a country like India and you say, okay, 1.3 billion people. You take a country like, let's say, the Republic of Georgia, that's in Central Asia, or a former Soviet republic. They have 3 to 4 million people. You take Jamaica, 2.7 million people, approximately 3 million people as well. Cuba has 11 million people. So you have all of these different demand conditions that you have to manage, like a portfolio. So if you have all of these different outlets, it's a portfolio, and you have to manage all of these outlets as if you're managing a portfolio. And then you have to think about which are productive and which are not productive. So you might shut down a production facility and you say, okay, we're going to move this to Mexico because this facility in this country isn't productive. So you'll kind of move it around to make sure that you maintain your efficiency. And we know about transportation costs, and we've talked about that before. One of the things about, and this isn't in the book, but one of the things that you consider when you have production facility, and we know about location advantage, but here it says comparative advantage afforded a location due to its factor endowments. Factor endowments are what? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship is another in some textbooks. So, and that means that if you have the factor endowments, favorable factor endowments, that gives you an advantage to perhaps set up a captive market and maybe an anchor market. Write that down, this idea of the anchor market, where you anchor into a specific area. Let's say your production plant is there. Let's say you develop distribution channels in that country. You produce those products, you use those distribution channels, and then later on you use the anchor market to expand in that region to other countries. And perhaps that would be your facility, not only for that country, but for neighboring countries and maybe for countries that are thousands of miles away. So you have that as a potential advantage, establishing an anchor market. Availability of infrastructure to support production facility. One of the things you have to get control of is your distribution channels, your infrastructure. What is the infrastructure? I mentioned in market entry, I drew a diagram on the board that if you bring your products into a port, you might have forced, you might have a body of water, you might have a road with potholes, you might have an unpaved road, you might have a mountain, you might have any number of obstacles. You have to look at these. But what is really, really something that is common when you go to developing countries is you might have a very poor road network, and you have these feeder roads that are not paved, that have these humongous potholes. And when I say potholes, I'm not talking about the potholes in Chicago that you see in the wintertime because the asphalt has somehow expanded and then contracted, and then you have this chunk of asphalt that comes out and you get a pothole. Well, these potholes are on a totally different level, and I can show you some pictures, a couple of pictures behind me. This is Nairobi, Kenya, and this is what a real pothole is. This is a real pothole. This is not the potholes that I mentioned in the American cities, but these potholes are the size of a car. And frankly, we were avoiding these potholes, going around them on a major road going to the Coca-Cola plant that we were visiting. And it's a major impediment when you start talking about logistics. You have to talk about time to delivery. When are you going to bring the shipment? Okay, you're ordering, let's say you're ordering a cargo of Coca-Cola products, and you want to know when that cargo is going to be delivered because you have to make orders to your stores, right? You have to deliver to those stores. And they might say, well, given the fact that we're using this network of roads, then the time in which you're going to receive that will be 17 minutes, right? That is given the quality of the roads. Now, let's say, for example, that road is rebuilt. The road that I just showed you on the photographs, that road has been redone from what I understand. Now, that may cut your delivery time from 17 minutes to 8 minutes. That is a tremendous improvement in terms of how much more efficient you can deliver your products. You can actually double your load because of the fact that instead of 17 minutes, it takes you 8. You can deliver 2 shipments in the time that it took to deliver one previously before that road was repaired. So that is a major issue, and it's easy to underestimate the impact that has. But if you've been on some of those roads like I have in some of these countries where you're in this van and the driver is doing this, avoiding these huge potholes, and then you go in these potholes and the van just goes up and down and your head is hitting the ceiling because you're bouncing up in this vehicle. I mean, it's absolutely insane to see the condition of some of those roads. When I was in Kenya and we were going to Tanzania, the Chinese were actually building those or paving those roads, and they built a nice stretch of roadway that is brand new. It makes life a lot easier, let me tell you, and it makes it a lot more comfortable. Trade policies, financial and economic risks, direct investment incentives, political considerations. Of course, these are all issues. When you talk about all your uncontrollable elements, you all are researching political, legal, economic, financial, social, cultural, technological, human resource management, competitive, distributive, all these other elements. But certainly all of these have to be considered as far as your distribution. One of the other things I have to say is we have talked about corruption, we've talked about ethics. And in some of these countries, I'll be clearly honest, you're taking your shipment through and okay, you have your papers, everything is together, and the police flags you down, stops you, looks at your paper, your paperwork, inspects your vehicle, and then they say they make draw attention to something, and they'll say this is something that you need to correct. Your strap isn't on properly, and in order to go through, you have to give me a bit of dash. So you pay them and you you move on. Now, obviously, that's it's a bribe because they're pointing to something that was wrong in your delivery system, and then they want direct payment so that you move on. So those are other factors that you have to consider. And we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we're not to engage in giving bribes or receiving bribes. But in those situations, what do you do? Honestly, what do? You have a cargo. This is your cargo that just came off the port. You're moving your cargo from point A to point B. The police flags you down, and they inspect your vehicle, and they point out something and tell you that you need to pay X amount of dollars in order to push through. What do you do? That is a valid question. And it's a hard question because we have this act that is supposed to tell us that we're not to engage. But in some cases, either you pay this fee or you turn back around and you figure out another way. And that can be a very costly decision. If you say, hey, I have to abide by the law, you turn back around, you could have driven 100 miles. So what do? It's very difficult. It's a very difficult situation when you're in countries where the distribution channels, are very, I would say, unreliable. Unpredictable. Unpredictable is a better word. So closing, I'm winding down here. We're almost at the hour mark. And I mentioned the location advantage. A product can serve all customers worldwide. If a product can serve all customers worldwide, then production facilities can be in one country. So you're talking about standardized products. Standardized products. And, well, I will say that having a standardized product would be the best scenario if the product is the same and that you're exporting to different countries. That would be the best possible scenario. Because otherwise, you would have production facilities in various countries and you would tailor that product to suit the specific needs of that country. So that's more of a multinational approach, more so than a global standardized approach. If the product must be customized for different countries, then multiple facilities will be needed. Proximity to customer markets, suppliers, component production facilities, and raw materials are important considerations. Again, location advantage. It all makes sense. Location of the production facility can affect customers' image of the product's tangible and intangible qualities. Here's the other thing. You have this thing about branding of raw materials. What do I mean by branding of raw materials? Well, you have a couple of different concepts. You might have a product that is made out of Egyptian cotton, right? That is a branded raw material. Egyptian cotton is famous. Or you can say these are Kenyan coffee. It's branded. It is considered a very high grade of coffee. You might have something like rubber from Liberia or Liberian rubber. Liberia is one of the largest producers of rubber. Or maybe it's Ghanaian cocoa, which is, again, one of the leading producers along with Cote d'Ivoire of cocoa. So you have these branded type of inputs that people perceive to be of a very high quality. And so on your product, you can say made with 100% Egyptian cotton. And that just makes it more prestigious. And so if you can get a resource of Egyptian cotton, then that makes the product a lot more attractive. Location of a production facility is a long-term decision. You better believe it, because when we talk about foreign direct investment, that is a very steep cost. And what are the risks? The risks are you're setting up a production facility and you have all those uncontrollables that I mentioned. You might have labor rights that you have to deal with. You might have salaries. You may have other types of conditions that you're not used to. Maybe there are cultural conditions. There are accommodations you have to make for your workers to ensure that they're happy. And these are things that if you establish a production facility, you have to be happy with all of these different conditions. Otherwise, it's going to be you're going to suffer losses in the long run. Companies may relocate production facilities as new opportunities appear around the world. If those opportunities are not in the country where the production is taking place, maybe they're nearby. Maybe this is the anchor. You get some of these markets, maybe, or your production facility is there. The market is not yet there, but you have markets close by. So that's also another advantage. Relocation can cut costs, but result in significant loss of jobs, which we talk about outsourcing again. You go offshore, you produce your components in another country, then those people that were working in manufacturing plants in the US, they have to be laid off. There's no way around it. So these are all different concepts that we're familiar with by now. If you've been watching this for the whole hour, we're being a bit redundant here, but here's one of the structures that you can see the different supply chains. And one of the ones that they did not put in this diagram is when you have a situation where you have the manufacturer going directly to the customer. So you have the supplier, you have several suppliers going to the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer using distributors and retailers to get to the customers. But then you also have the manufacturer can go directly to the customer in some situations. In other situations, the manufacturer can go to a wholesaler, the wholesaler can go to a retailer, the retailer can go to another retailer, to a distributor, and then to a customer. So the length of a supply chain is very important to understand how that would affect the delivery of your product. Hopefully you won't have a perishable product, because if you have a perishable product, then what happens? Your supply chains have to be short. They cannot be long because, of course, perishability makes it not a feasible option. So some of the ways to improve global supply chain management: the best run firms usually have the best supply chain in that superior supply chain management. And so they talk about standardization, a standardized process, or benchmarking, in terms of making sure that you have that quality. Many of you understand Six Sigma and all those quality control methods. The reliability of having consistent quality, which reduces product cycle times because you have a standardized process, decreases customer response times, reduces overall product cost. I have a video of a supply chain professional who talks about some key points as far as how to maximize your supply chain. And here are some of the things that he points out. Take a look.
my lead, you will cut contract negotiation cycle time by 75% and get better results. Again, I'm a little bit short on time, so I'm going fast. Please forgive me. The next thing we're going to talk about is cost modeling and benchmarking for success. Now, the only thing I can't teach how to do those here. It needs a full day. But what we can do is talk about what are the 4 different types and how to use them. At least you can get your buyers on the right track and make sure they're there. So there's really 4 different types that we're looking at. The first one is a must-cost model. Now, you may have different terms, okay? A must-cost model. The next one is a should-cost model. Third one is benchmarking. And the fourth one is a total cost model. And any one of those can be used to drive TCO reduction in your total cost of ownership, right? So let's talk about what these are and when you would use them. And that's really all I have time to get into with this presentation. Okay, so the must-cost model is really a budgetary constraint model. It's basically, pardon me. Let me talk about it, then I'll have that come up. It's basically used when you know that the amount of money you have is not enough, that you cannot use benchmarking, you can't use a total cost model. There's no situation where you're going to have enough money to buy what it is you need. And so normally we don't like to tell budget, right? The supplier asks, how much money do you have for this? We don't tell them. This is the one exception. So a cost model is when, a must-cost model is when you know that price exceeds the budget under all scenarios. No matter how you look at it, you will never have enough money for it. And then so you go back to the supplier and you say, listen, I'm going to put my cards on the table. This is all I have. Okay, I'm not going to expect you to lose money to work with me on this. You can't ask suppliers to lose money. We want healthy suppliers. But you can say, here's my problem, here's why I need these units. You come back to me with a proposal, and if you don't have an idea now, I want you to think about it. How can we do this differently to meet this price? Maybe you take some features off the product. Maybe, there's something differently you can do to take costs out of the supply chain, take costs out of the product or service, to change the scope of work or the specifications, to do it at an aggressive target of this price. And you would be amazed. Suppliers first say, we can't do it. But you send them home and you say, come back to me with a proposal in 48 hours. Okay? When they come back, they always come back with innovation. They always come back with innovation and with something new. And we're going to use the supplier's own game with them. In America, I don't know if this happens here. Companies call. They call you at home, and then they talk to you about a product. You don't even know who the company is. They talk to you about a product. Then at the end, they say, how would you like to pay for this, Visa or MasterCard? Does that happen here? They don't ask you if you want to buy it. They ask you how you're going to pay for it. So you do the same with suppliers. You don't ask, can you produce a proposal? You say, when can you get me a proposal by? We're going to assume that they're going to give us a proposal, and you ask them to come back with a new and different way to do it at this price.
So that was Omid Gamami, who had worked for Intel for 18 years as a purchasing and negotiations expert. And he talks about some of the things that should be done to optimize the whole process of the supply chain. And he gives a lot of very good examples here, or a lot of very good tips. And when you work for a company like Intel Corporation, that is very much a capital intensive industry when you make microprocessors. And you have to have your act together if you run a business like that, because it is highly specialized. And the amount of R&D costs that go into an Intel chip is tremendous. So all of your costs have to be assumed somewhere along the way so that you're not simply losing money. And so, yeah, it's about cost, and it's about a process, and about all these other things that have been mentioned during this hour. And here you have the anatomy of an ERP system, a single database, and then you have modules of these various strategic business units. There used to be a concept of fat server, skinny client, which meant that you had a fat server with all the material on it, and you had a skinny client where each department used terminals. No local storage, but just used a dumb terminal, what was called a dumb terminal, and you would pipe into the mainframe, and the mainframe had all of this data. And each department had access to a different part of that database. Then when PCs started to emerge, it became this skinny server and fat client, where the server just had programs, all of these different programs that it was hosting, and then the client or the PCs would gain access to those powerful programs, but then they would then download and save the files locally on the PC and then work on them separately. Now we're back to the fat server, skinny client again, maybe a combination of these different anatomies. And again, these are some issues that we have to deal with: multilingual, multinational, multi-currency. So that's going to do it for chapter 13, very crucial concept. And I just want to say, as you go on to take Dr. Etienne, Eisenhower Etienne, wonderful colleague of mine who teaches logistics, I believe it's called logistics, and you'll learn about these concepts. It would behoove you to develop an appreciation of how these processes work, because it is the nuts and bolts of business. And you can tell him I said that, but I believe marketing, is everything as well. There's internal marketing within an organization, and there's external marketing. But supply chain is the nuts and bolts of business. That is where all these processes come: the inputs, the design, the production, the marketing, the distribution, the financing comes in there, and you have this value chain, which I have behind me, the value chain, which you may have seen. And which is different from a supply chain. Now, you put a value chain, you can put it on top of supply chain, and it can tell you all the different components that goes into the process. But yeah, definitely very, very important. So when you take Dr. Etienne or any other professor for supply chain, maybe you take it in graduate school, make sure you pay attention, because that is the nuts and bolts of business. If you're an entrepreneur, controlling cost, looking at your entire supply chain, from your supplier relationships to procurement, relationship procurement has with the supplier or suppliers, the relationship that procurement has with R&D. R&D has to make sure that you're getting the right components that are needed so that quality and compatibility are there. The R&D has to go to production and say, well, this is how the specs of how you are to cut this product, or how you're to make this product. The product is made, their marketing runs the numbers, they do their testing, they do all of these different things in the market, and then they tell production, okay, we need you to roll out this many, and we're going to launch our initiative. Then the distribution takes over. We're going to use retail, we're going to use wholesale, we're going to use distributors, we're going to go directly. And then the customer, then you have customer service. So that is the entire supply chain. It is very important. It is the nuts and bolts of business. And if you understand the supply chain, you will be on your way to great success in business. And whether you be an entrepreneur or whether you be a corporate level, chief level executive, a C-level executive, or whether you're just a mom and pop shop, I think you'll be on your way to success. Okay, so that will do it. Make sure that you're meeting in your groups, that you support your team leader in making this project. You have another week, but we have our exam on Thursday on 2 chapters, chapter 12, chapter 13, global marketing and supply chain management. I think you'll do well. We've been doing well this semester. Keep it up. And Tomorrow we have our journal articles. Our journal articles will be on international marketing. Again, a very fascinating and very dynamic topic, and we'll look to have a lot of different types of articles on tomorrow. So hopefully you have had a good break, and I'll see you on tomorrow, and we'll have our last journal day. Okay? Take care. Have a good day.